Welcome and welcome back to day 2 of TRT World Forum. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion so far. I'm Nafisa Latic, a presenter and the host of Across the Balkans, and I'm very happy to moderate and discuss the next topic that I'm also very interested in. Now, the session is titled The Rise of Eurasia and the Remaking of the World Order. So let's begin. Now, key regional actors that once considered their Asiatic political and economic orientations to be secondary to those of the West have increasingly embraced their place in a broader Eurasian system. From Turkey and Russia to Iran and the Gulf states, the dependency on the West is being loosened, while they look to Asia to build their strategic ties. So what impact will this have on the world system? Does Europe see its place in its Eurasian awakening, economically, politically, and culturally? And what about the US? And how does this fit in its Asia strategy? Definitely stick around. We'll try to get you some answers on those questions. And I promise you an interesting debate because I have an outstanding panel today with me, and my guests are the leading voices for this topic. So please welcome Bruno Maçães. I said that in Portuguese. I hope it sounded right. A senior advisor at Flint Global, a top consultancy firm. He is the former Secretary of State for European Affairs in Portugal. He is also an author of several books that you've probably heard of, including Dawn of Eurasia, Belt and Road, and Geopolitics for the End of Time. That's his latest book. Then Sanjaya, a distinguished fellow at United Services Institution of India. Previously, he was the editor of the Economic Times, Financial Express, and Business Standard. Charles Grant, the director of the Center for European Reform, a think tank located in London, Brussels, and Berlin. He's an expert on European foreign and defense policy, Russia and China's relations with the West. And Michael Kugelman, the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center, a think tank in Washington, and he's also a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. Alexander Dugin, a Russian political analyst, strategist, and author, is supposed to be here with us, but he had to cancel due to some personal issues in the last minute. We will try to have him some other time. Okay, so let's get this discussion going. Bruno and me already tweeted that this is going to be a blockbuster event. I hope it will. So Bruno, let me start with you. With this global competition between China and the US on the rise, it seems like everyone's talking about it lately. So are Eurasian states doomed to choose between one camp or the other? And what are the other options available to them?
Right, this is the question that everyone is discussing. Are we heading towards a bipolar world or a multipolar world? I have to say I'm on the side of those who think we're heading to a multipolar world. I see many countries not wanting to choose and perfectly capable of not choosing. We have this paradigm of the Cold War, but the Cold War was very specific. Many parts of the world were coming out of decolonization. Their countries were still being built. Their nations were still being built. Technology was much less widespread worldwide. We have now a completely different situation. And, let me pick the case of Turkey, since I'm talking to a Turkish television network primarily. Shown over the past few years, not that it's moving away from the West, in my view, but that it wants to be strategically autonomous, wants to make its own choices, and now makes choices that sometimes are perfectly aligned with Western interests. I would think, for example, in Idlib they are, but it makes those choices without calling Washington first. And I see many other countries in Eurasia as a whole trying to develop similar strategies and trying to pursue their own interests, sometimes balancing between the two main powers, but other times actually not even asking them. And that's the future that I anticipate much more than a new Cold War or a bipolar system.
Right, and I do want to ask you one more question here at the beginning. 3 years ago, you published the book Dawn of Eurasia. Now, 3 years later, are we closer to the consolidation of Eurasia as a geopolitical concept today?
Yes, I think we are. We've seen that China invested in this Eurasian idea. China is now interested in consolidating its power all over Eurasia, including Europe. And I think in the minds of Chinese strategists, the scenario is a world where the United States becomes a kind of an island on the shores of Eurasia. But China has a structural control and influence over Eurasia as a whole, or at least large parts of Eurasia. We see that Russia, I happen to be in Russia today, Russia is completely comfortable with the idea. It is a solution to many of its problems. We see that Turkey is in many respects trying to balance between East and West. And we see that even the European Union is now much more interested in projecting its power eastward because it understands that it is vulnerable from influences from the East. So certainly, this space is not becoming united as a political unit. If Alexander Dugin was here, he was probably going to advocate for that. I don't see that, but I see that it's becoming an integrated political, security, and economic space where borders between different areas, starting with the border between Europe and Asia, have really by now, I think, collapsed.
Now, with you mentioned European Union, I do want to go to Charles then now. So where does Europe see its place in this Eurasian awakening, economically, politically, and culturally, especially now in post-Merkel era, regarding Russian influence in the bloc? What kind of changes can we expect? And is the EU itself set to take the Eurasian turn in post-Merkel era?
I can't hear him.
Okay, it appears to be that we cannot hear Charles. Let me check if we can fix his connection in the meantime. Okay, let's go to Michael. Michael, where do you see Europe and its place in this Eurasian awakening? What can we expect moving forward in its strategy?
Yeah, thanks. You can hear me, I assume?
Yes, yes, we can.
Very good.
Great. Yeah, I think that I'm probably better placed to speak about the U.S. Place here. I defer to Charles and others to talk about Europe. And I think it's interesting because we talk so much about this U.S.-China competition, which really for the U.S. is the most dominant foreign policy concern. That was the case with the Trump administration as well. But if you look at some of these regions that we're talking about today, and looking at Central Asia, for example, I would argue that you really don't see the U.S.-China competition playing out very heavily there. The U.S. has long been absent from the Central Asian region, and particularly now that it's withdrawn from Afghanistan, I think that will eliminate even more opportunities for it to play a role. What we've seen in recent years is China, along with Russia, stepping up their activities and their role in that broader region, and the U.S. has really been quite absent, and this is known. The U.S. government has rarely come out with any type of strategy, specific strategy, with plans for a policy in that region. There have been a lot of visions that talk about new Silk Roads and things like that, but none of this has actually been implemented for sure. And yeah, yes, there was a new arrangement, a new Quad. This is the era of Quads. You had a U.S., Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan Quad that was announced several weeks before the Taliban fell, but it's not going to go anywhere. And I think that really was not something that had much substance to it. So I think it's important when we talk about the issue of possible new Cold War between the U.S. and China. I think that rhetoric tends to be a bit overheated and a bit exaggerated, just because you do have areas of the world where this competition is not playing out all that heavily. Certainly, there are plenty of other areas where it's very fierce, East Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, and other areas. But I think it is important to point out that this is not a competition that plays out equally intensely in all parts of the world.
Right, Michael, I did plan to go to the US round a bit later, but you brought it in earlier. I do know that we should focus with you more on Asia. But let's go back to Sanjaya then now until we wait for Charles to be ready for the more European Union strategy. Sanjaya, we are obviously seeing this increased interconnectivity between Eurasian actors. So what's the possible impact of this, and what's the role of China's Belt and Road Initiative is set to play in reshaping and rise of Eurasia?
Well, you see, first of all, from an Indian perspective, we have always been part of Eurasia. In fact, we are one of the few countries which has been part of the Indo-Pacific and Eurasia at the same time. I mean, India has been at the crossroads of Asia for centuries. And I think what I see from an Indian perspective is a rediscovery of those linkages. The Indo-Pacific is very much in the focus. Maritime linkages are the focus. But at the same time, Eurasian linkages. Just a day ago, India, the United States, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates announced the formation of a new Quad, which has a West Asian focus. We have a Quad with an East Asian focus with the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. So I think the Indian view is that we are spreading across Eurasia as well as India, and China has been part of this network just like India has been for centuries. So I think China and India have a natural link into Eurasia, which both of them are trying to rediscover through different means. I think on the issue of where is Eurasia in the world today, while I agree with Bruno that we are all headed towards a multipolar world, I think what we are going to see in the transition between what was unipolar and then bipolar into a multipolar world is what I have been calling a bi-multipolar world. In other words, a world in which the US and China seek to dominate. And both the US seeks to dominate in the Indo-Pacific, China seeks to dominate in Eurasia. But there are other powers, and India is one of them. Certainly Russia is another. I do not see Russia as being a camp follower of China. I think Russia has an independent mind of its own. It values its strategic autonomy, as indeed we in India do, as indeed you in Turkey do. And then Iran. I mean, there are lots of big powers in Asia, in Eurasian region, which will assert their strategic autonomy. And therefore, the world we are heading into is one which I characterize as a bi-multipolar world. And this is an idea I picked from Samuel Huntington, who at one point talked about a uni-multipolar world, in which you have the US at the top and there are 5 or 6 major powers. And I think what we now see is China and the US kind of emerging at the top. But many of us in Eurasia and in the Indo-Pacific are not going to allow the world to be dominated by 1 or 2 powers. We will assert our strategic autonomy.
Right. Bruno, how do you assess the potential of the Belt and Road Initiative? I've read somewhere that you've said that you've seen this more as a political project than as infrastructural project. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. So originally, back in 2013, you could hear Chinese strategists talk about a Belt and Road as a project to be concluded in 2049. Then a little bit later, around 2018, you started to hear that the project would take 100 years to be completed. So it's very obvious that it's not about infrastructure. What takes 100 years to be completed? It has to be a project to somehow change, overturn, revolutionize the world order. And when China calls it a community of shared destiny, the expression, I think, would be translated into Western language as world order or political order. That's fundamentally what the Belt and Road is about, and I think China is continuing to pursue it. Michael can talk about this in detail, but you're seeing developments in Pakistan, we're seeing developments in Indonesia, even under the difficult conditions of the pandemic. So I'm one of those who thinks that the Belt and Road is going to stay with us perhaps for a few decades, if not the 100 years that it's planned to last.
Right. Okay. I hope we have Charles now. Charles, I hope you can hear us and we can hear you. Yeah, we needed you for this EU strategy, definitely. But I do want to ask you on BRI something too. It has been claimed that European firms merely get crumbs from BRI projects. Are they victims of unfair competition? What's the problem here? Is it more structural because of the difference between the Chinese and European models are anchored in deep historical and philosophical dissimilarities?
I don't think Europeans are particularly concerned about getting only crumbs from the BRI. The concern they have more is that the standards for social and environmental issues applying to the contracts are weaker than we would wish in Europe. So I think the Europeans think that China is building the BRI without sufficient regard to social and environmental standards. But can I answer the question you asked me a bit earlier about the where the EU fits into all this? I think strategically we are in a bipolar world. I think when it comes to military affairs and strategic affairs, I think the Europeans have little choice but to line up more or less with the US against China because of the values we share in common with the US, the democratic values. But in economic terms, I think the Europeans don't want to particularly line up with the US against China. I think they want to have their own. They have their own interests rather different. Europe depends more on trade with China than the US does. Europe is not a strategic actor in Asia like the US is. We have a very fundamentally different approach to these issues. I mean, I think if China behaved better in the terms of human rights and in terms of theft of intellectual property, things like that, the Europeans would be quite happy to have a very close relationship with China. Well, they're not concerned about China as a power per se. Americans are very different increasingly at the moment with the current views in Washington. I think Americans, even if China stopped abusing human rights and was nice to the Uyghurs, and even if China stopped stealing intellectual property and did the other things that annoy US firms, I think America would have big concerns about China as a power because it's a strategic threat to the US interests in the Indo-Pacific area. So I think there's a fundamental divergence of interest between Europeans and Americans, which means that it's going to be very hard to get the two of them working together well on China, even if push comes to shove, if there is a new Cold War in the strategic area, then I think Europeans have little choice but to line up. Just a final point on this. We talk about the EU as a unit. The EU, of course, is not united on China. If it wants to criticize China on human rights, Hungary generally vetoes such resolutions. Greece is very close to China. A number of other countries are very close to China. Mrs. Merkel herself has been reluctant to get too tough on China in public, given Germany's very close economic ties to China. So the Europeans are not particularly united on China, but there we are.
Right, Michael. What if Belt and Road project turns out to be successful? Regarding of all this we've just heard from Charles too. What then?
Well, I mean, certainly, here in Washington, if the goals of BRI are looked at strictly through an economic lens, then there's no reason to be opposed to them because, the U.S. at the end of the day supports these ideas of infrastructure development and jobs and employment and energy security and prosperity and development and all that. But, as we've all noted, because of the reality of the U.S.-China competition, the fact that China is behind BRI means that the U.S. is going to have to be opposed to it. Now, it's a big if it will be successful. And I think that we've seen the struggles that it's faced in recent years, particularly the concerns about debt in many of the countries taking on Chinese investments in places like Pakistan, which is really the centerpiece of the BRI project because of the CPEC project, that China is increasingly concerned about security threats. China's economy has shown signs of a slowdown, which could impact BRI progress. So it's a long way to the point where we could talk about it being successful. But this is something that the U.S. will oppose. The U.S. has sought actively to try to develop plans for alternatives. It's going to be very difficult to do that. The U.S. cannot hold a candle to what China has been able to do with the sense of deploying capital into these infrastructure projects with BRI so far. And we know that in recent weeks, at a G7 meeting, there was an agreement to come out with some type of new infrastructure project that would be meant to serve as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's all visions. It's nothing else. It's nothing beyond that. And it's interesting that if you look back to when BRI first emerged, the U.S. had no opinion on it. It had not formally opposed it. It wasn't until the competition heated up between the U.S. and China, that's when you started getting the formal statements opposing BRI, CPEC, and anything associated with BRI. So if the U.S. certainly will accept BRI as something that's there and is evolving, it's not in a position to do anything about it at the end of the day. It's not going to lead to the risk of a conflict or anything like that with China. But it's something that the U.S. will never be able to accept from a strategic purpose, just because it's China that is behind this, even though the intended outcomes of BRI are meant to produce outcomes that the U.S. is firmly behind, even though the techniques and the tactics used with BRI, particularly in terms of contracts that are very opaque, and the very major concerns about inequitable exploitation of local resources, all of that, these are the things that the U.S. worries about. But the actual outcomes that are meant to come about are things that the U.S. would not disagree with. But again, because this is China that's behind this, there will be that categorical opposition from the U.S. government, come what may.
Right. I want to go to Sanjaya now. For India, also, no other bilateral relationship is more complex and challenging than the one with China. So what's Indian perspective on BRI? What India plans to do when it comes to it? And can we expect more, approvals from New Delhi than we have from Washington?
Well, India was one of the first countries that questioned BRI. It questioned it on the basis of two principles. First, it's asserted that this was a purely unilateral geopolitical initiative of China, not based on consultation with the countries that were securing the, becoming a part of the program. And secondly, that there were no transparent principles for the sanctioning of the various projects. I mean, I think one of my co-panelists talked about concerns about climate, environment, labor standards, etc. All these issues were brought up by India. So India, from the very beginning, viewed BRI as a geopolitical initiative, not as an economic initiative. But its response to BRI, given that it now exists, has been to partner both with Japan to what is called PQI, the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, where Japan and India are now working together in looking at connectivity in Asia, in Africa, and also with the United States. So I think our response has been to partner with the US and Japan to provide options in a more transparent manner to countries that are looking at infrastructure, at air connectivity, sea connectivity, land connectivity, telecom connectivity, different types of linkages.
Bruno, I want to go to you now. So obviously, China is now a big factor in European politics. Too many debates on what to do with China. But do all the countries in the EU need to be on the same page when it comes to this matter?
Yes. I'm not sure I entirely agree with Charles that Europe is very divided on this. Europe is divided on many things. On China, there's a number of principles that I think are shared by all member states, including the usual suspects that are often seen as close to China. We're interested in trying to separate politics from economics. And that's, I think, shared across Europe, and of course, it's much less accepted in the US, where the economic question becomes highly political. But we believe that economic links can be preserved if China agrees not to interfere with those economic links, including on the question of subsidies, for example. And then, that separates us from the US to some extent. And then I think there's also wide agreement, and I've heard this from Hungarian officials even, to go to one of those countries that are sometimes seen as close to China. I've heard from those officials that they agree that the relationship has become imbalanced, that China has, in a way, taken advantage of Europe in many respects, and that we need to refound the economic relationship on new grounds. Because China is no longer a developing country, and it has to play by the rules. And it can no longer benefit from exemptions to those rules. And the effort in Europe now is, in a way, to try to rebalance that relationship. China has been resisting. And when I think with the recent investment agreement, that I think was an important step, obviously politics got in the way. So in that sense, it has turned out to be quite difficult for Europe to pursue this idea of separating politics from economics. But I don't see any sign that we're about to abandon that strategy, in part because we don't see a better alternative. And when we look to Washington, we're even starting to see under Biden that some of the European language has started to be adopted. We saw the other day USTR Catherine Tai say that the US is interested in recoupling with China. Well, I interpret recoupling as coupling on different terms, coupling in a different way. That's my interpretation of her words, and that's also what Europe is interested in. So basically, we're all a bit stuck and unsure how to deal with this problem called China. But it seems to me that Europe has a strategy that is widely shared, if not universally shared in Europe.
Right. Charles, the UK, US, and Australia launched a pact to counter China back in September. It's called a Historic Security Pact, called AUKUS. China already called it extremely irresponsible. How will this agreement impact the political landscape in Eurasia? And what does it say about the current dynamics at play in the international system?
Well, I think it's a very interesting pact. I think the French were even more annoyed about it than the Chinese because they lost the contract to build submarines for the Australians. I think it does show that if China goes on becoming more powerful and more assertive and behaving in a way that some of its neighbours find rather bullying, there will be a counter-reaction to that. We've talked already about the quartet of India, Australia, America and Japan. We've seen now the quartet, the trio of the AUKUS countries, Australia, United Kingdom and US. And I think other countries also that are worried about China will start working more together to try and, if not contain it, to sort of protect themselves and defend themselves against possible Chinese assertiveness or even aggression. So I think it's indicative of a wider trend. But I wouldn't say, I don't think it means a huge amount. I mean, let's remember the UK is not a significant Asian power. I mean, it's a small middle-sized European country. The level of rhetoric, it is tilting to the Indo-Pacific, to quote a recent government statements. It's going to not only done the AUKUS deal, it's also wants to join the CPTPP trade agreement. British ministers are under instructions not to mention the word EU in their speeches. It sent an aircraft carrier to the Pacific Ocean recently, but that's mainly at the level of symbolism. In terms of what's going on in reality, most of Britain's strategic and defence commitment is to NATO to defend Europe, and the United States is quite clear it wants Britain to be a leading defender of Europeans against possible aggression from somebody else. So I don't think we should say that in reality the British have sort of left Europe and tilted all the way into Asia at all, despite their rhetoric. I would just mention very briefly the problems between the British and the French. It is of some relevance to what we're talking about. I've been running a small think tank for 24 years. In that time, the relationship between London and Paris has never been as bad as it is today. The fact that the British sneakily did the AUKUS deal with the Australians and Americans behind the backs of the French is only part of it. There are many bigger issues as well, obviously relating to the way Brexit has been handled. The French have taken a very hard line on Brexit, and the British don't like that. And the British have been extremely rude to the French. The French are threatening to cut off electricity supplies to the UK. The British ministers are being extremely rude to the French. This actually matters because it's affecting security cooperation in Europe, and it affects the ability of Europeans to work together constructively in Asia and with Asians. So it's quite serious. I hope the rift is ended soon. But at the moment, I see neither Emmanuel Macron in France nor Boris Johnson in Britain show any signs of wanting to bury the hatchet with the other one, and it's getting worse rather than better.
Okay, and Michael, do you want to add something when it comes to AUKUS agreement here? I do want to bring you here on the same topic too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that AUKUS, it's important to look at it from the context of the momentum that the Quad has experienced. And these are two very different types of groupings in the sense that the Quad certainly has a security dimension, but it largely has emphasized non-security cooperation, climate change, pandemic cooperation, technology. whereas AUKUS is a clear security pact. And I think for China, and to an extent Russia as well, views AUKUS as particularly concerning and alarming just because it comes even as you have this momentum experienced by the Quad. And everyone knows that even though you rarely hear China singled out explicitly or mentioned in the context of messaging about the Quad is all about China, for sure. I think that's quite clear. So, AUKUS, as I understand it, is something that had been negotiated for quite some time over a period of many months. And, but the timing, though, for it to be announced right at a moment that when the Quad was about to have its first ever leaders meeting in person, I think that sort of solidifies the concerns for the Chinese and the Russians. But there's been a lot of talk lately about how the U.S. or how the Biden administration is trying to strengthen alliances and friendships that became frayed during the previous administration. And yes, you could talk about how the U.S. is now a new crisis with its French ally. But I think it's notable that it managed to come out with this new pact with the UK and Australia, two of its closest allies, even in a moment when there had been concern about the U.S.'s continued commitments to its allies and partners, concern that was exacerbated by what happened in Afghanistan over the last few weeks before the withdrawal was completed. So I think that AUKUS does represent a triumph, maybe not a triumph, but a success story in terms of the U.S.'s abilities to work closely and solidify cooperation with its key treaty allies.
I want to mention here one more agreement. Iran's full membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. What does it say about Iran's strategic outlook as well as China's vision for the international order? Sanjaya, maybe you can elaborate on that one.
Well, that fits into my larger perspective on a bi-multipolar world, in which, Iran certainly, like, as I said, Russia, India, China, Brazil, there are a lot of middle powers, if you like, that are looking for space, seeking space for themselves. And Iran is an important country. Iran is geopolitically important and geoeconomically important. And therefore, any Eurasian institution will have to have space for Iran. And therefore, I'm not surprised that Iran seeks to be in the SCO and will find its way into SCO. I think the game as we go forward is a game that India's Foreign Minister Jaishankar termed as multi-engagement, because a multipolar world requires multi-engagement. And each of us is engaged in multiple, multilaterals, plurilaterals, bilaterals. We just mentioned Quad. There are now 2 Quads. There's 3 Quads. In fact, there's also a Quad with Afghanistan and Pakistan in it. So we are in a world in which the UN system is not working. Multilateral institutions are not working. The 2 major powers, China and the United States, are challenging this system. And therefore, all of us who are not the big powers, who are middle powers, are looking for space. And Iran certainly, like India, is also looking for space for itself.
Bruno, before I go into another round of questions about post-Taliban takeover and its impact in Eurasia, I do want to ask you, what's the role of Turkey in all of this, especially in these latest developments, and what can we expect, what kind of strategy it has until now?
Well, as I said before, what I find striking over the past 5-7 years is this concept of strategic autonomy that we talk a lot about in Europe. Turkey seems to be implementing. I tweeted this the other day and got a lot of pushback, but how else can we read what's been happening? And Turkey has been developing a defense industry, and we're starting to see the results of that in Karabakh, for example. And Turkey has started to develop what is sometimes called a multi-vector diplomacy, talking to Russia, and I understand that Turkey tries to compartmentalize its relations with Russia. There are tracks where things are going well, tracks where things are not going as well. There's an attempt to do that. Continue to talk to Europe, continue to talk to the US. But it seems to be a kind of model for what is happening in Eurasia as a whole, that you have these actors trying to develop an independent foreign policy. We also see it in India. India does have the issue of China, which Turkey doesn't have in the same way. And that has created a certain alignment with the US over the past 5 years. That's another interesting development of the past 5 years. And I'd be interested in what Sanjaya thinks about this, but I suspect there are some limits to that alignment. And if the US pushes too hard for complete alignment in all areas, that India would not accept. And that also fits with my idea that the chessboard is very complicated. It is a network of relations between all the main actors and can't be reduced to the simple idea of a China-US confrontation.
Sanjaya, please jump in here if you want.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I agree with Bruno. I mean, you just take one simple example, which is something that both Turkey and India are having to deal with, which is the purchase of S-400 missiles from Russia. Turkey has already been subject to sanctions by the United States because Turkey is a member of the NATO and therefore, is within a framework where the US felt it had to impose sanctions. Now, India is being threatened with sanctions if it goes ahead with the S-400 missiles. But the Indian government has repeatedly said that this is a contract, we have signed a contract, and we are going to honor the contract. And it remains to be seen how the US will accommodate our need to secure these missiles. So this is one example, and one can think of other examples where despite a very strong strategic partnership with the United States, and I was part of the government when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh signed up to this strategic partnership with President George Bush. I was very much involved in that process. But despite that strategic partnership, we seek strategic autonomy. And I would imagine that would be the view of Turkey or indeed many other major countries which have a close... I would imagine even with a country like Japan going forward. I cannot see Japan behaving very differently from Germany as we go forward into the next couple of decades.
Charles, how do you see the role of Turkey in the next decades? That is already a bridge between Europe and Asia, and also an important ally of the European Union.
Well, the relationship between Turkey and the EU is a very difficult one. Turkey pretends it wants to join the EU, and the EU pretends that Turkey wants that, and the EU pretends that it wants to have Turkey as a member. Neither is totally honest in that. Both think at the moment it's in the interests of both of them to keep up the charade of Turkish negotiations. The pro-Europeans in Turkey, that as far as I understand, the ones I talk to, don't want the negotiations to end because they see them as kind of anchor for keeping Turkey in a Western orientation. I must say that seen from the West European capitals I've been in recently, there's a real worry that Turkey's leaning east. I know that Turkish friends will say we're trying to be just autonomous strategically, and we're not leaning east or west. We want to be, as Sanjaya said, we want to sort of be multi-vectoral in our foreign policy. But seen from European capitals, there's a real fear of Turkey going very much eastwards. I mean, it stopped criticizing China because on the Uyghurs because it wants to be close to China. It's obviously very close to Russia on certain issues, not only the S-400s. It has understandable strategic interests in Central Asia. And we, the European Union would be quite happy to have a close relationship with Turkey, which is of course holding on to about 4 million Syrian refugees in camps, preventing them from coming into the EU, which is of great favour to the European Union. But I think the EU will agree to have a better customs union for Turkey and much closer relationship. But if Turkey behaved better on human rights, I'm afraid the EU's government's line is, so long as Turkey behaves in the way it does on human rights, we don't want a much closer relationship. And at the moment, relations are not good at all. Though I think the worse they get between the US and Turkey, the more the Turks try and get closer to the EU, and then they play a game of playing one off against the other. But at the moment, it's not particularly good as far as I can see. But about one footnote to that: the British don't care about the human rights at all. They're very happy to be close to Turkey because the British government has very few friends in Europe and needs the Turks as a friend.
Okay, let's switch gears now, and I'll go to Michael. One country in Eurasia that's caught world's attention these past few months, of course, is Afghanistan. what potential impact will a Taliban-led Afghanistan have for the political landscape throughout Central and South Asia? Can the US and Pakistan cooperate in Afghanistan? What could be what are the possibilities of that kind of cooperation?
Yeah, well, it's very much a work in progress. There's still a lot of uncertainty about what's going to play out in Afghanistan. We don't know if the Taliban will be able to consolidate and maintain power, and that could have a lot of implications for the region. Certainly, I think one of the initial impacts of the Taliban takeover relates to terrorism and terrorist threats. You've had many terrorist groups in Afghanistan and the broader region that have been galvanized by what the Taliban was able to do. It took over power, it managed to get the Americans out of Afghanistan, and it took over power even before the Americans had left. So this is intoxicating for many of these militant groups. And to single out Pakistan in particular, they have very good reason to be concerned, because there is another Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, which is a separate group from the Taliban in Afghanistan that for many years had waged a horrific campaign of terrorist violence in Pakistan. It had been weakened in recent years because of counterterrorism offensives, but it had been resurging over the last year or so, and it has been galvanized by what the Taliban in Afghanistan has been able to do. And we've seen in the days since the Taliban took over in Afghanistan an upsurge in attacks by the Pakistani Taliban in Pakistan. India certainly has reason to be concerned as well that terror groups, Pakistani terror groups, including Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, they've been galvanized as well. And these are groups that traditionally have carried out attacks in Kashmir. The Taliban in recent days has indicated that it is going to champion the cause of Kashmiri Muslims, and that's something else that could galvanize these India-focused terrorist organizations. So I think that's the big fear now. Beyond that, it really depends on whether the Taliban is able to consolidate power, or if it's not, and you have a new armed resistance, and then Afghanistan is plunged back into conflict or a civil war, because more instability in Afghanistan would mean more negative spillover effects for the region, certainly refugees being one of them. Even now, with the economic crisis in Afghanistan, we've seen refugees coming to Pakistan and Iran, which have traditionally been their preferred areas to go to, but Tehran and Islamabad recently have indicated that they're not in a position to take on as many Afghan refugees in the past. And this has implications for Europe, for Turkey, for many of the EU countries, just because we've seen in recent years increasingly Afghan refugees traveling to Europe via the Mediterranean. And I think that for the EU states, there's a lot at stake, in particular when it comes to the types of assistance that they provide to Afghanistan for humanitarian support. Because if they're unable to deliver enough assistance to ease the humanitarian crisis, that raises the chances that there could be a new upsurge in refugee flows to Europe, which would pose a policy challenge. Very briefly, in terms of US-Pakistan, certainly Washington continues to see Pakistan as an important player in the context of Afghanistan. I think that the US sees Pakistan as that country that can press the Taliban to try to show more respect for human rights and women's rights. I think that's a fool's errand. The Taliban is not going to change its views along those lines, no matter what Pakistan does. Beyond that, I think that there's a lot that's unclear, but the US, I believe, wants Pakistan to continue to play a role in US counterterrorism activities in Afghanistan as the US tries to develop this new type of over-the-horizon capacity to focus on counterterrorism goals when it's no longer there. So Pakistan has provided overflight rights to US military aircraft for quite some time. It's going to want to look to continue to have that type of cooperation from Pakistan at the least. But broadly speaking, I think the US-Pakistan relationship will be downgraded, and I think expectations should be lowered, just because for so long the US has viewed its relationship with Pakistan through the lens of Afghanistan, and the US has essentially left Afghanistan, at least militarily and diplomatically. So I think that we could have some difficult days ahead for that relationship.
Sanjaya, during the tenure of Prime Minister Imran Khan, Pakistan has sought to strengthen ties with many countries, especially Afghanistan, post-Taliban takeover. Could Pakistan's diplomatic campaign succeed in convincing the world to engage with the new Taliban government in Afghanistan?
Well, I think the answer to that question is in Kabul. If the current regime in Kabul decides that their focus is the development of Afghanistan, I think all of us would like to help Afghanistan. But if they see their victory in Afghanistan as the beginning of a new jihadi campaign across the world, including in Pakistan, including in other Islamic countries, then we are looking at an unleashing of a new wave of terror, like the ISIS and the Al-Qaeda. It's not very clear in what direction the leadership in Afghanistan would like to go. Just now, as we were discussing, I've just seen on Twitter that a young girl in the Afghanistan volleyball or football association was killed. Women are under tremendous threat and danger. Women are not being allowed to go to college or school, or men and women have to sit separately. I mean, all the victories that women in Afghanistan won over the last 20 years have all been removed. So either we are going to look at a civil war in Afghanistan, or Afghanistan becoming the home of a new wave of global terrorism, not just aimed at the West, but across the Islamic world. And I think, therefore, the real answer to your question lies in Kabul. What is the future that the current leadership that has secured control of Afghanistan, what is the future they have in mind for their people? If it's a future that means empowering their people, eliminating poverty, building schools, building colleges, giving freedom to women, treating men and women as equals, then the whole world will work with Afghanistan. Otherwise, I'm afraid, we are not going to see a very happy future.
Bruno, does this represent a turning point for the region, the situation in Afghanistan? And how might dynamics on the greater Eurasian continent influence the geopolitical orientation of the group as they seek to navigate the murky waters of international politics?
I think it showed the limits of American power across many dimensions. The limits of American military power. It's interesting that the Wikipedia article on the Afghanistan war says something like the war started in 2001, ended in 2021, outcome the Taliban won. And it's difficult to get around that reality. But also the limits of Americans' ability to shape societies outside its borders. That even after 20 years, essentially, there's nothing left of the American presence. The only thing left is the lives of those women and girls and others that were improved during these 20 years. But if you look at Afghanistan today, there is nothing left of the American influence. So I think we're forced to recognize that America will focus its energy on specific geographies, as Michael said, perhaps East Asia, Taiwan, and other limited geographies. But the America as a global presence, I think, belongs to the past. And Afghanistan is significant, I think, because it showed us that reality very vividly. And unless you want to avoid seeing it, I think it is there for everyone to see.
Yes, you repeated many times that you think the balance of power is on the much larger stage and the US is becoming more distant from Europe. So what is the plan B when the US is no longer there, Charles? We've seen what happened in Afghanistan.
Well, I think the French draw very clear conclusions from America's rather unimpressive departure from Afghanistan. The French and some other Europeans as well. President Macron is a big believer in what he calls strategic autonomy, which has been mentioned already by others. That is the fact that Europe should have the ability to act on itself, by itself, without anyone's permission in the military sphere, but also in the economic sphere. In the military sphere, Macron is making it a big priority of the French presidency of the European Union in the first half of next year to build up defense capabilities. The trouble is that, a lot of Europeans don't really share that vision at all. In Eastern Europe and the Nordic countries, a lot of them are very worried that if you push strategic autonomy too far, you upset the Americans and reduce America's commitment to Europe. I myself think Macron's got a lot of good arguments in favor of what he's trying to do, but it's the key swing factor is the Germans. Will the new German government that will be formed in a few weeks share Macron's view that Europe needs strategic autonomy. Will Germany spend more on defence? Will Germany actually to try and develop the kind of interventionist military culture that the French and the British have, which they don't share at the moment? I think it's a long, hard slog ahead for those like Macron who believe in strategic autonomy. But I think there's not really much alternative in the long run because, and one other factor just on reinforcing the same point, President Trump, when he was in power, was a very strong argument for Europe to do things by itself because he didn't even commit to NATO. He almost pulled America out of NATO. If Trump returns in 2 or 3 years' time, or somebody like him returns, that'll mean that Macron will, I think, win the argument, and even reluctant Germans and other Europeans will go along with Macron's view that more money needs to be spent on Europe building up military capabilities for Europe itself.
So what does Europe need to do? Do Europeans need to think outside the box and focus more on strategic issues? I mean, the balance of power in Europe was traditionally between Germany, France, and Russia. Are we seeing a shift now?
Well, I would say my own view is that Europe is, Bruno may have a different view, I think Europe is heading for a rather period of French preeminence because the British have left the European Union, because Angela Merkel is retiring and the Germans have a new and unproven government, because Spain and Italy are never that influential, because Poland has too many arguments with other European countries. I think the French are in a very strong position to set Europe's agenda. They've got their key people in place in Brussels, Mrs. von der Leyen, Mr. Michel, Mr. Borrell. They're all protégés of Emmanuel Macron. And I think France has the abilities to try and set the agenda, but of course the Germans remain hugely influential and important. Unless they go along with that agenda, then it's very hard for France to do much. My own view is that Europe should focus less on Asia, actually less on the Indo-Pacific, and more in its own backyard. The Balkans is an awful mess, as the Turks know very well. North Africa is in a state of disarray. Parts of Eastern Europe, including Belarus, which is a country I know well, are in a bad way. And I think Europe needs to try and sort out its own neighbourhood, improve its neighbourhood policy, find ways of working with neighbours, including Turkey, before it tries to sort out the problems of Asia. It needs to start nearer to home, I think.
Right, Bruno, do you wanna jump in here?
Well, we saw that France in the recent AUKUS affair. We saw that France really had a lot of difficulty bringing other Europeans around to its position. A lot of it happened behind the scenes, but there was a lot of resistance. And I think it was a clear case where Europeans should have stood behind France. But there's, of course, a certain national feeling, and there's many European countries that actually, on issues like this, will feel closer to the US than even to another member state. So if you ask me what is the future of Europe, I have to say with a kind of a bombastic sentence that it's either supranational or it isn't. And I think the story over the next 10 years is to see whether these periods of crisis, which now we have even at the constitutional level with the decision of the Polish court, whether this period of crisis can be overcome through a supranational moment where more powers have to be moved to Brussels. And I think that's really the only way that Europe can remain relevant as a global actor and to preserve our independence, our sovereignty, which I think is increasingly under threat. Let me remind you that just a few months ago we had this extraordinary event of an airplane flying between two EU capitals being hijacked by military fighters belonging to a small dictatorship on our borders. And our reaction was quite weak, to say the least. So obviously the moment is one where Europeans are increasingly aware how vulnerable our position is, and I hope increasingly aware that the answer has to be supranational.
Right, so Sanjaya, obviously EU has troubles in dealing with the US. Does China has the power to replace the US in Europe?
I don't think so. I mean, China, as one of my friends said, is certainly a major economic partner for US and for Europe, and will remain so. But I don't see European Union moving from one dependence to another dependence. They have had 50 years or more than 70 years of this transatlantic relationship. They're not going to give up that in order to have a trans-Eurasian dependence on Chinese power. I think Europe, like Russia, like India, like Turkey, I imagine, like many of the middle powers, will continue to seek strategic autonomy. Now, when I say Europe, I mean really France and Germany. I think other parts of Europe will fall in line. At least this is the way we would like in India to see Germany and France play that role. We would like to see, countries like Japan, Germany, France, Russia play a larger role in international affairs, so that we are able to strengthen a framework in which neither the US nor China return to the old pattern of unipolar or bipolar dominance. I don't think the world today is going to accept that kind of a situation, because I come now from an economics perspective. The geoeconomics of the global system has fundamentally changed. There was a time when the United States was the main engine of growth. China, of course, is emerging as a very important competitive engine of growth. But Germany is an important engine of growth in Europe. Japan is also an important engine of growth. We play a certain role in our part of the world. So therefore, there are many other engines of growth emerging. And I don't think Europe will accept Chinese dominance as a substitute for American dominance, except they will try to preserve their economic links. But even there, they're diversifying. German companies are looking at other markets. The phrase, the term I prefer is de-risking or diversification. I think decoupling was a wrong phrase. I think Donald Trump was the one who brought it into play. And I was surprised to hear just now that the USTR, Catherine Tai, has talked about recoupling. Now, decoupling, recoupling, these are wrong terms, because the world cannot decouple from China. What the world is trying to do, and many of us are trying to do, is to de-risk, to reduce our dependence. Because the fact is that in the last 20 years, many economies in Europe have become excessively dependent on China. This has increased their, the security risk for each of those countries. And I think I find Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India, ASEAN, EU, everybody trying to reduce their dependence on China, not to increase their dependence on China.
Michael, so how will the US position itself regarding all these developments, and how does all this fit into its Asia strategy?
Well, the Biden administration has made clear that the competition with China will be the central focus of its foreign policy, and at the same time, the administration intends to focus on strengthening its alliances, and that does entail, I think, trying to broaden a global consensus that includes some of the U.S.'s top allies, including those in Europe, to counter Chinese power. And that does not necessarily refer to security policies. It refers to the types of things that we're seeing emerge from the Quad in terms of developing infrastructure projects, developing or producing and distributing pandemic vaccines to push back against what China is doing in Asia and beyond. So, the U.S.-China competition will be preeminent in strategic calculus of U.S. officials for sure. But there's some exceptions to this, right? Another big goal of the administration is climate change mitigation, and it has left open the possibility of seeking pathways for cooperation with China in areas where it serves U.S. interest, and climate change is one of these areas. And it actually got to a point, some of you may know that John Kerry, who is essentially the U.S. climate change czar, he's housed at the National Security Council, he had reportedly made an argument that the U.S. should suspend its competition with China so that there could be a full focus on cooperating with China, negotiating with China on climate change mitigation. He was outvoted. This is not the view of the administration on the whole. It's not going to happen. And we have seen that when you have had some high-level exchanges between American and Chinese officials, since the Biden administration took over, hasn't gone very well. There was an infamous encounter in Alaska some months ago where there was a shouting match that developed. So the U.S. wants to try to, I think it wants the relationship with China to be less toxic than it was in the Trump years when you had a lot of, just really heated, angry, polemical, anti-China rhetoric. I think the Biden administration wants to move away from that, seek cooperation where it can, but I think it's going to be difficult to try to improve the relationship in ways that can allow for more cooperation on the issue of climate change. And so I think that we will see the U.S. continue to focus on the Quad initiative, both Quad initiatives, the established one in Asia and this newer one, which I think we need to be thinking about a lot more, that involves the UAE and Israel and India, as well as these G7 efforts. The U.S. wants to use those types of arrangements to develop new mechanisms to counter Chinese power. And certainly the administration recognizes it as part of a long game and recognizes that there's some areas where the U.S. cannot claim to attain the parity with China, particularly when it comes to infrastructure. But the idea is to play the countering game over the longer term.
Right. Bruno, when we were introducing this panel, we definitely said we're going to discuss the West and its future. So will the U.S. remain the leader of the West? And what are all these latest developments mean for the future of this term, West?
Yes, let me try to answer that question with reference to the recent UKUS affair. Because, well, let me say I wasn't impressed by America's say in this affair, in part because I think what was achieved was perhaps what you would expect. The U.S. already has defense treaties with Australia and the United Kingdom, obviously. There's a partnership for technology transfer, but it doesn't seem to me anything unexpected or any kind of breakthrough. On the other hand, the polemic and the difficulties with France were revealing of a deeper problem. That U.S. does not seem to regard Europe as part of the same community anymore. Because I think a few decades ago, maybe even 2-3 decades ago, we can only think back to the Iraq War, the U.S. still had this understanding coming back from the deep past that Europe is part of the same community. And whatever important affair we are involved with in the world, we do it together, even if it is part of Afghanistan or Iraq. And that no longer seems to be the case. The US very bluntly thought from the start, Michael perhaps can tell us something about how this happened, but within the National Security Council, the decision was that Europe had nothing to do with this. And what was particularly shocking in the affair was that France found out before the Australian media found out. After the Australian media found out. The Australian media actually had some news about what was about to happen before the phone call was made to Paris. So for many Europeans, that was shocking because it reveals that the US is now more interested, let me put it in terms of our session, in the balance of power in Eurasia, and that regards the different pieces in Eurasia, Europe, Russia, China, India, as contributing to that balance. But what seems to have disappeared in the meantime is this understanding of the West as a political, historical, civilizational community that is no longer regarded that way in Washington, even by Biden, because we knew it wasn't regarded that way by President Trump, who never had a particular fondness for this concept of the West, if he understood it at all. But it was revealing in that sense, and I think it forces Europeans to also rethink our strategy. In particular, I think to be less dependent on American support and American help. And the question I would leave to the panel and to the audience is, if tomorrow we have a very serious problem in our neighborhood, in Libya, in Lebanon, again in Syria, the situation remains very unstable and unpredictable, is it really sensible and reasonable to turn to the US to solve that problem? I think it's very clear that either we solve it ourselves or we'll have to deal with the consequences. And again, to go back to my previous answer, if we start to think about these things through and seriously, we have to conclude that European power has to be better organized at a supranational level so that we can deal with these challenges. But for the United States, for Washington, the conclusion seems obvious that we now have Eurasia. And the priority is to keep the balance of power, because the United States has always felt that if Eurasia comes under a single power, comes under the domination of a single power, that America is under threat. And there was a time when Germany was that power, there was a time when Russia was that power, now it is China. But the community of the West, the philosophical, civilizational community of the West, is difficult to find it in decisions being made in Washington today.
All right, we've lost Sanjaya. We'll try to get back to him soon. So I'll go to Charles now. So as Bruno was saying, obviously the West cannot survive without a strong Europe in some way. So what is the continent's future? Can Europe recover here and reassess its strategy and become a rival to China and the US in the future?
Well, the short answer to your last question is no, but let me take issue with some of the things that Bruno said. I think Bruno puts too much into the significance into the AUKUS business. I mean, the truth is America, I think, including Biden's people, do believe in the West, broadly defined, as a community of democracies committed to the rule of law, who have similar values, who should help each other. But the problem is America has always acted unilaterally. I remember Bill Clinton's administration. People in Europe complained hugely about Bill Clinton's unilateralism when he was a nice, supposedly pro-European Democrat in power. The Americans don't bother to consult Europeans when they act in Afghanistan. They pulled out without consulting the British, who committed 450 lives to the Afghan war. They did AUKUS without consulting anybody, of course. The British who were part of it. So the problem is American unilateralism. I don't think that just because America feels it has to challenge China in Asia and not give up its role of being top dog in Asia, that doesn't mean it doesn't believe in the West. The West is about values and ways you govern countries. And I think America is still very committed to NATO. It wasn't when Trump was around. And I think if Trump comes back or somebody like him comes back, then there is a question about America's commitment to the West. And I do totally agree with Bruno that Europe needs to get its act together. And in any case, whether or not America stays committed to the West, the Europeans need to spend more on defense, organize better. But as I said before, I think they should focus on their near abroad. They have to sort out that the Balkans is a hell of a mess, the Eastern Europe, North Africa, these are difficult areas. Europe isn't going to be a strategic actor in Asia for a long, long time, if ever. It needs to sort out its backyard first.
Bruno, does the EU need to continue to exist to be able to fight other dominations, in your opinion?
Yes, absolutely. Let me say that I'm in a conference in Russia, and we met a foreign policy official that has to remain anonymous because of Chatham House rules, but I can tell you what he said privately without revealing the name. And basically, I'm kind of surprised to see that these days people in Moscow think that the European Union is about to collapse. And that's how to explain the recent humiliation when Joseph Borrell visited Moscow. And I think the kind of dismissive attitude that you see every month coming from Moscow towards the European Union reflects that conviction. Where they got it, I'm not sure, that they now have to wait until the European Union collapses and then they will see what to do with Europeans. Well, it's not going to collapse, that's for sure. There's a very clear understanding in Europe that if the European Union were to disappear, the economic impact would be devastating and our political irrelevance would soon reveal itself in deep dependence towards other actors. So I have no doubt the European Union will survive. It needs to be reformed, it needs to be strengthened. But by the way, even right now, it's very easy to understand why the European Union exists. I came to Russia, I've already done a multitude of tests. In Europe, in the EU, you can travel freely without any tests. There's a common regime, rules are accepted. And you know that if the global supply chain collapses tomorrow, and if states start to impose restrictions, by the way, I think it would be perfectly plausible that the United States would impose a ban on export of energy to Europe if it becomes necessary to bring prices down for the Biden administration. But I know that inside the EU, there will be no energy bans on energy transportation across Europe. So that's invaluable, and we're not going to give it up.
Okay, Michael, what about the US? Will it remain the leader of the West, or will the 21st century be the century of China and Asia?
Yeah, I agree with what others have said, that China is not about to displace the United States in Europe. I think that there's no logical country to step up in place of the US in Europe. And as I said earlier, if you look at other areas of the world, absolutely, China can and has displaced the United States, particularly in areas like Central Asia, and even increasingly in the Middle East to some extent. If you look at this, this striking degree of investment that China has made And ironically, the UAE and Israel, two countries that now form part of this new Quad, been a number of Chinese investments in the shipping sectors in the in Israel and the UAE. But no, I think that that Europe and the West continue to be a priority region, so to speak, for this administration. It fits into this idea of strengthening alliances. The NATO alliance is very important for the administration. Make no mistake. I mean, that is seen as a critical relationship. And the administration knows that its relations with its NATO partners may have suffered to a degree after the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, and of course the things that came up before that with the lack of coordination with NATO partners. But this will be a priority for the administration to work through those issues. And similarly, the U.S. commitment to its treaty partners in Asia, Japan, South Korea, and the like, those are priorities as well, for sure. So. Certainly, one could argue that the U.S. is a struggling empire, so to speak, if you even want to call it an empire, so to speak. And I think it is important to keep in mind some of the domestic context here in the U.S. That the Biden administration has placed a lot of stock on getting things back in order at home. As important as foreign policy is, the competition with China, climate change, and so on, the administration has been very focused on getting a few signature bills passed on Capitol Hill. Even legislation that it had planned on getting through quite easily, such as an infrastructure bill and more recently a climate change package, because of the deep levels of polarization in Washington, which have not gone away when President Trump went away. That has been a major constraint for the U.S. government in terms of focusing and pursuing its domestic goals. The pandemic seems to have turned the corner here with the pandemic for now, but we're not out of the woods. The economic situation has improved, but not out of the woods. So my point is that, yes, the U.S. will want to continue to remain a leader in the West and globally, but at the same time, it's still emerging from a period where it was suffering from several different generational crises right in the U.S., a pandemic, a major economic crisis, and also social tensions, racial tensions within society, which had not been as bad as they were over the last few years as they had been for a number of decades. And the U.S. is still trying to emerge from that, which could impact to some degree its ability to push forward with its foreign policy goals.
Right, Bruno, I'm going to quote you again. I'm a big fan of your books and your articles, so I will quote you in one thing. You said whoever finds a way to deal with climate change will run the world, will be the dominant power. Can you elaborate that on for us?
It seems to be the case if you look at history, modern history, that the country that was able to establish its dominance over new energy paradigms became effectively the ruler of the world. It happened with Britain in the first industrial revolution, and then the United States in the second industrial revolution. First coal and steam engine, then electricity and fossil fuels. And I know that in China, people are convinced by this philosophy of history, and they believe that this third industrial revolution, this third energy revolution, can be used by China to overturn the American-led order. I always get the impression that Chinese thinkers are convinced that China will replace the US not through a world war, but through economic transformations, large economic transformations. And clearly, China has embraced climate policy, not so much because it is directly concerned with the environment, but for more geopolitical reasons, because it thinks that whoever controls these energy sources will control the world's economy and therefore world politics. I'm actually encouraged to see that the European Union has also started to embrace these ideas. One of the most interesting developments in the EU over the last 2 years, if you read some of the policy papers that no one reads, but these reflections appear everywhere, that climate is also about geopolitics, and that Europe, after having lost the internet revolution, has the possibility of using the climate revolution to re-emerge as a dominant economic actor. And there's even some speculations about how we have to guarantee access to raw materials and rare earths worldwide. So it's clearly an important game, and on the one hand, you might say it's a bit sad that climate is being contaminated by geopolitics. On the other hand, it's actually encouraging because it leads actors to actually do something if they're convinced that it is about geopolitics rather than the poor old climate. I saw that Secretary Blinken a couple months ago said that if the United States wants to win the race against China, it has to lead the climate revolution. So this is, I think, a certain transformation in climate policy, that it has become geopolitical in nature and very, very vividly.
Charles, do you agree with Bruno? How significant will be the climate change in this shifting of balance of power in the next couple of decades?
Yes, I think that's right. In terms of technology, obviously the Chinese are leading the world when it comes to batteries for electric cars. They're the leading producer of solar panels, of wind turbines, so they seem to have got the right ideas when it comes to technology. But they also produce 28% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So, and President Xi Jinping is not turning up to the Glasgow COP conference in a couple of weeks, partly perhaps because the British have been rather rude to the Chinese. I don't know if that's the reason or not. I have no idea. But I think, as Bruno said, the Europeans have a chance of taking a lead here when it comes to climate change. They're very, but there will be a lot of difficulties in relations with other countries. President Macron and the EU are committed to what's called the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. This is the idea of putting tariffs on goods from companies in countries in parts of the world that don't limit carbon emissions. This will affect Turkey, China, Russia, Ukraine, probably the United Kingdom too. They'll have to pay tariffs on exports to the EU. But if we don't have the kind of carbon emissions reduction systems that satisfy the European Commission, this is going to be a source of great tension indeed. But I do think Europe has the potential to take a lead here. Let's hope it keeps it up. Certainly, it's very good. Politicians are very good at adopting virtuous targets when it comes to climate change, because it's their successors, a generation down the road, will have to actually implement the very difficult decisions about making people feel poorer because of it.
Okay, Sanjaya is back with us. Sanjaya, if I can go back to the discussion about the US-China relations, how do you see the recent anti-China alliance led by the US with India as one of the key member countries?
Well, we don't see it as an anti-China alliance. I think we see both the East Asian Quad and the West Asian Quad, which was recently launched out of Tel Aviv, as a fact is that till the turn of the century, till the year 2000, China and India were more or less in the same neighborhood in terms of economic size. In the last 20 years, and we need to catch up. And our priority is the economy. And we look at countries like the United States, Japan, Australia, Israel, Germany. They're all technology economies. We look to them. We look to them for technology. And our entire aim is to become a stronger economy, a bigger economy, and to have greater self-reliance in terms of our defense capability. India is focused on the defense industry. So I don't see the India-US relationship as anti-China. In fact, I keep telling my friends in China that what we have been seeking in the last 20 years is really a relationship with the United States that comes close to the relationship had with the US for the last 40 years, 50 years, ever since Henry Kissinger went to Beijing, and we are just celebrating the 50th anniversary of a visit by Nixon and Kissinger. There was a the United States, of which China certainly benefited, and the extent of economic interdependence between China and the US is far more than the economic interdependence between India and the US. So when we look at our relationship, look at it as an anti-China issue. We certainly have problems with China. China has become very aggressive. It is occupying some of our territory. It has killed our soldiers in the last couple of years. And China is not dealing with terrorism that emanates out of Pakistan. These are all issues which are of concern to us.
Okay, Sanjay, we are having some troubles with your audio, but I do want to ask the same question to Michael briefly. How do you see the recent alliance? Is it going to be effective?
Yeah, I agree with Sanjay that it's not an alliance. India does not do alliances, and it may have moved closer to the U.S. than it ever has before, but it doesn't do alliances. It continues to emphasize strategic autonomy and maintaining the agency to act as it wishes, and it believes that alliances would constrain it. And I would argue that what has brought the U.S. and China together a lot in recent years, there's certainly things like shared concerns about Islamist terrorism, a desire to trade more and to pursue cooperation around energy and so on. China does play a role. I mean, China has been a major factor in bringing the U.S. and India closer together and in boosting the prospects of the Quad. But it's not about containing China. It is about countering China. And I think here, again, it's where this Cold War rhetoric comes into play when it shouldn't. The U.S. does not want to contain China. India does not want to contain China. I think that the idea that they both, the New Delhi and Washington, share a goal of wanting to push back against China through non-military means, through the development of capacities that can counter what China has been able to put out there. Again, infrastructure, public health, the vaccines, that type of thing. So I think that's an important point to put out there. But on this issue of the U.S. and India, I think a very important point has to be made here. Pardon me, U.S. and China. An important point has to be made here. Infrastructure is going to be a huge issue for global politics for many years to come, for global affairs, for global economics as well. China has the upper hand when it comes to the deployment of capital to produce hard traditional infrastructure, roads, bridges, and the like. But it's the softer forms of infrastructure, the newer forms of infrastructure, telecommunications, fiber optics, that type of thing. China has that capacity too, but that's where the U.S. and its allies, Israel, Japan, Australia, and others to an extent, I think that's an area where the U.S. can push back, particularly if these technologies are deployed in a way that is not authoritarian and involving surveillance in the ways that China does. I see that as a really key issue, to look at infrastructure through those two different lenses, because I think the U.S. and its allies and partners do have a potential advantage there to counter China. Again, not through military means. I don't want to suggest that, but through non-security means. There's a lot of ways to try to push back against what China has been able to do.
Right. Okay. We came to the last couple of minutes of the session, and I do want to have some kind of conclusion from all of you by asking you, so how COVID actually reshaped geopolitics, and did all these Eurasian countries that we mentioned showed strength in fighting a common enemy, and how did it change the world order in the next couple of decades? What can we expect? Charles, do you want to go first, maybe?
I'll go first and give my concluding thought at the same time. I think it's clearly a lot of factors have damaged the US's reputation in the last 20 years. The Afghan war, the Iraq war, the financial crisis, Donald Trump, and the COVID business did as well, because America did not handle COVID very well. China handled it much better, so that's damaged the West. But my concluding thought is really back to what Bruno said. The West is weak if the West is divided. America, it needs to look to the West needs to look to its internal politics to become stronger externally. America is horribly divided between Republicans and Democrats. There's an awful battle to dividing society. The European Union is divided between Western Europe and the Poles and Hungarians over the rule of law issues, and the British have dropped off the edge. So I think my answer to how to get a strong and influential West is sort out your internal problems, and then the rest of the world will respect you and pay you some attention. But if you're weak and divided, as both in some ways the US is and the EU is, Europe is, then the people won't respect you and you won't have much influence on the world.
Okay, Bruno.
I remember reading Secretary Blinken saying that the main challenge for the US in the next few years would be to try to bring European democracies and Asian democracies together. And so far we haven't seen any of that. On the contrary, I think the opposite showed the difficulty of that project. Well, we'll have to keep watching and see if Blinken is able to bring that about. That would, by the way, be a Eurasian strategy that the US never had. the US always thought of Europe and East Asia as two separate worlds, and they need to be brought together, whether by the US or by someone else. On COVID, I think it contributed to the erosion of the global order as we knew it. Many norms, many institutions were found wanting. Some norms were abandoned and some institutions failed. I think Sanjaya already said that the UN is increasingly irrelevant, and I think it has again showed its irrelevance during COVID. And also called our attention to the fact that competition between states seems increasingly to be about who does a better job mastering natural threats. Could be pandemic or could be climate change. I think competition between states is probably going to take this indirect form rather than direct kinetic conflict. Michael already expressed some reservations about the likelihood of that. But whoever deals better with climate change, whoever deals better with the pandemic, and whoever deals better with a global supply chain crisis that we're seeing now, those will be the challenges, and whoever does a better job will come out on top. That's the world of, there's a certain return to a state of nature, a state of more naked competition rather than the very thick global order full of norms and institutions that we are accustomed to. It was a pleasure being in this session with all my esteemed colleagues, and hope to see you soon.
Right, Sanjaya, Michael, I have 2 minutes for both of you for the final thoughts. Sanjaya, if you want to go first, I hope we sorted those audio problems with you.
Well, I also, I want to repeat Bruno just said, only say that I entirely agree with what he has said. So, and I think what he's
okay, seems that we didn't sort that problems. I have to leave it there, Sanjay, unfortunately. Yeah. Virtual studio, virtual links, it happens. Michael, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, very briefly, COVID did not change the world order. It simply accentuated the challenges of the current world order, and that includes a lack of multilateralism, a lack of great power cooperation, and also it accentuated the toxic forms of nationalism and protectionism and intolerance as well that have become such major realities for so long. And it's unfortunate because there's never been a time in recent times when global cooperation was more necessary, just because we're dealing with some really serious shared global threats, the pandemic for sure, but beyond that, climate change, which is going to eventually get to the point where it could become an existential threat. But unfortunately, what we saw with the pandemic is that you really didn't have leadership. The top powers were not in a position to work together to lead some type of coordinated global response. And this is unfortunate and also, quite frankly, very troubling, given what we're looking at ahead with future pandemics and worsening climate change threats. So with that, I echo what others have said. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this panel, and thank you for having me. Great discussion.
It was a pleasure for me too. Really, thank you, Bruno, Sanjaya, Charles, Michael. I know it would be much better to have this long session in person here in Istanbul, but it is what it is. Hopefully, last virtual forum from virtual studio. And I do want to apologize for all the audio problems that we had during this session to our listeners and viewers. Thank you all, and I hope to see you in Istanbul maybe next year for the forum so we can discuss these topics in person.